It is quite difficult to ask for traditional concepts that influence Chinese behavior concerning old age today. These concepts were not stable throughout the ages as they are presented quite often these days, and partly they were also contradictory. Old age was praised because it entailed wisdom, but we do also find in ancient Chinese texts the idea that old age could entail senility. There were numerous and complicated rituals to honor the old, but at the same time, the Book of Rites, compiled in the 2nd century BC, also quite clearly states that these rites were there because old age is not pleasant at all. According to the same text, a wife of a prince had to call herself this old wife when she went to see the ruler over the empire, and it is obvious that no positive associations were associated with this term. One very much gets the impression that rights are a compensation for what human beings lose when old age approaches, and that there was a widespread fear of old age and its consequences in ancient China. Mengzi, famous philosopher living in the 3rd century BC, speaks of a proper state of things when the 70-year-old can eat meat and are able to wear silk clothes. But this probably just means that usually this was not the case. The young and strong ones probably got these things, but old people didn't get them, and it was the duty of the ruler and the state to enable them to get the same position as young people had. Only a good king, the Confucian philosopher says, is able to integrate old people in social life. If he pays respect to the, they say, 3 times old or the 5 times venerable at ceremonies that were prescribed to take place yearly, the reason was probably not that he thought that he needed these people desperately, but that he showed to everybody else that he was able to give proper respect to them and that others would have to expect the same treatment once they had gotten old themselves. Classical Chinese texts never demanded from children absolute obedience to the will of their parents. To be sure, Mengzi, whom I just quoted, said, "The desire of the child is towards his father and mother. When he becomes conscious of the attractions of beauty, his desire is towards young and beautiful women. When he comes to have a wife and children, his desire is towards them. When he obtains office, his desire is towards his sovereign. If he cannot get the regard of his sovereign, he burns within. But the man of great filial piety, to the end of his life, has his desire to his parents." This is the translation of James Legge, 19th century. Yet Mengzi then adds examples of cases in which a child has to be disobedient to his parents. What is really important is, according to Mengzi, not obedience itself, but the duty to produce children who can carry on the services in the familial temple of the ancestors. Thus, traditionally, respect for one's parents may have been important, but more weight was put on the spiritual aspect of this obedience. The book of filial piety, the Xiaojing, which contains the precepts for respect towards one's elders, also has a chapter which is entitled Reproof and Remonstrance. It explicitly demands that a filial son should admonish his parents if they are wrong or do something that is not right. So this is very important about Chinese culture, because many Europeans think that they used to believe in old people and to trust in everything they did. This is actually not Confucian. What was written in these ancient texts did not necessarily apply in all ages in Chinese history. Thus, precepts of the classic of filial piety may have been important in Han times, but they were supplemented by other precepts in late imperial Chinese law codes that were much more severe than they had been previously. The Xiaojing already contains the sentence that to be unfilial is the greatest possible crime. But this then has served as the basis for imperial Chinese law, which always has counted unfilial acts against one's parents or grandparents among the capital crimes. Under the Manchurian Qing dynasty, that is from 1644 to 1911, parents were even allowed to kill their children, while even unintentional killing of one's parents, several examples are given in the codes, was punished with draconic measures. Parents were also allowed to sell their children under the last Chinese dynasty. This may have been practiced also in ancient China, but there's no proof for it in ancient Chinese texts that this was legal. In fact, a legalist text from the 3rd century BC mentions that parents killed female infants, a practice that we see in China today as well. But this text, Hanfeize, does so with obvious reproof of the practice. So it seems to me that much of what is ascribed to a to a Confucian tradition of more than 2,000 years is actually a later development, and we have to look very carefully into the texts if we want to understand what happens. It's important to understand what happened under the last Chinese dynasty that was a foreign dynasty, and it is possible that they are now responsible for what the Chinese people think was the Confucian tradition, and they wanted to be much more Confucian than the Chinese themselves had been before. Late imperial China was the time when the so-called 24 examples of filial piety, the Xiao, flourished, a collection of stories probably put together in the 13th century, but actually I don't know this exactly. These stories from the venerated past were propagated with the help of images that were known to every single school child. For example, we there learn of a 6-year-old boy who went to visit, and now I have to check of a 6-year-old boy who went to visit a famous official and at this occasion stole 2 oranges. When he was discovered, he quickly declared that he had not done this for himself, but to nourish his parents, a claim that brought him the praise of all those present. You see here, I've taken the photograph myself from a book from Henri Doré, Recherche sur les superstitions en Chine. That is why also the titles are in French there. For a long time, you couldn't find these images in China. When I was a student in the 80s, I didn't see these images. Now they are coming back, and I'm going to talk about this shortly. Doré was my source of access to these images for a long time. He was a French missionary working in China in the end of the 19th century, and he collected calendar pictures. 24 paragons of the filial piety are, of course, something that has to do with the Chinese year. The Chinese year, as ours, is divided into 12 months, but the months then again are divided into 2 halves, and so you have 24 pictures that you can show and you can learn from them. Everybody knew these things. Another example is, a son was hated by his stepmother, but did not repay her with equally bad behavior, but then instead went on thin ice in order to catch fish for her. something no European father or mother would like to see. In Europe, we would expect that the story continues with the tragical death of the child. In China, however, things were different. Two carps were so pleased by the filial behavior of this son that they leaped out of the water in order to enable the child to bring back home a decent dinner. In one case, Wu Meng slept nakedly in front of the bed of his father because the family was too poor to buy mosquito nets, and he hoped to attract the mosquitoes to his own body. One more story is about a grandmother who had to share her food with her grandson. Therefore, the father of the child decided to kill his son and bury it while the child was still alive. The rationale behind this was that while it is always easy to engender a new son, you will never get a second mother. Fortunately, heaven was so pleased with this behavior that it let the man find a treasure while he was digging into the ground. You can't really see the gold there, but if you look, because I took the photo myself with my iPhone, and the quality is not really optimal, but it is reported that the Qianlong Emperor, famous for his encounter with Lord Macartney at the end of the 18th century, played the role of Lao Leiter in front of the imperial grandmother. Wearing his children's clothes, he danced and played at her birthday in order to give her the feeling that she still was a young mother. This, too, was a story from the 24 paragons of filial piety. You see this person here, the sleeves are much too short, and this is because these are children's clothes, and he still had them, and so he pretended to be a young child, and his aging parents were young again, which shows that in China one also liked to be young and not necessarily wanted to be old, as it is presented sometimes in Europe. Grotesque as these stories may seem to us, they are coming back to China today. Filial piety had been called the greatest burden of the Confucian legacy during much of the 20th century, and especially during the Cultural Revolution, which at certain points explicitly attacked respect towards the elders. In the 90s, and especially in the last 10-15 years, the 24 examples of filial piety are again used as a means of instruction. I myself have been able to take pictures of a set on a visit to a temple in Suzhou a couple of years ago. I think this is 3 or 5 years ago, and you see the same story of Lao Leiter playing with his children's clothes in front of his parents. This is the pagoda in Suzhou where I took the photograph, and there's another one where you can even see me behind. That is the story of Wu Meng, but the light is not ideal here for seeing this. Only recently, a high Chinese cadre and an influential academic in China came to Munich and gave a talk there, which was attended by many of our Chinese students. We had a huge room, much bigger than this was, one slightly less nice though. What was interesting was that the main argument of this man was that filial piety was the core element of Chinese culture. Apparently, many Chinese students accepted his idea, which, by the way, is not really original. There is one journal called Morality and Culture, Daoli Yuanhua, and there were several issues that praised filial piety explicitly in recent years in this journal. One may wonder why this is so. The man who gave the talk in Munich had already passed the age of 70, and he may be seen as an example for a phenomenon that is widespread in China, namely the influence that powerful old men have on institutions. Although the Communist Party, after the experiences of Tiananmen, which was widely regarded as a reaction by old politicians to young students who maybe took the wrong decision, and I think the Communist Party is thinking about this, it has been quite tough as far as limiting the time that a leader of the state can remain in office. It's interesting, they stepped down after 10 years, but still in many other institutions, old men still exert a lot of influence. Often I watched this in Chinese universities to the great dismay of the young, who are sometimes more able to adapt to the circumstances and needs of the modern world, but who have to realize that they cannot exert as much power as they would like to. So there's a tension there. It would probably be too cynical to find the reason for the praise of xiao, filial piety or obedience in modern times only in an attempt of the old to control the young. I don't think that this is a proper explanation. There's much more at stake at the moment. One other reason may be found in the fact that with the decline of the belief in Marxist education, there's a strong feeling that a whole generation of young Chinese is growing up without ideals and without proper values. Even members of the Communist Party are speaking of a spiritual vacuum that has to be filled. Partners of mine at Zhejiang University at Hangzhou have recently approached me to join a project to publish manuals for children education with classical Confucian ideals of filial piety. However, it seems that these plans have not materialized yet because the publisher, the Chinese publisher, has different ideas than the academics, and the publisher fears that the books might not sell as well as they think. So it could be that the younger Chinese generation does not easily accept the concept of filial piety as their most important goal in life. There's a widespread feeling in China that the young do not care for the elderly enough anymore. A census has shown that one of the most common fears in China is that the young might not take care of oneself when old age approaches. And in 2011, the government has even started to discuss, we just saw that in the constitution there are several laws, regulation what a child has to do. But in 2011, the government started to discuss whether a law should force children to visit their parents. I don't know the outcome of the discussion, but it's interesting that this took place. In a way, this reminds one of Mengzi, whose text seems to be a reaction to the same fear prevalent in China more than 2,000 years ago, that one might be neglected when one is old. A good Chinese government has to take care about the old, and I think that traditional values, at least the good aspects of them, should be cherished more than they have been in the 20th century, when they regarded often as stifling the country and its attempts at modernization, also because otherwise one could think that the party neglects its solemn duty to care for the old. Yet, about the question whether traditional values are indeed helpful or not, a heated debate is taking place in China. To obey traditional values was easy in former times, since there were very few people who reached old age. In a situation in which just 1 or 2% of the population reaches the age of 65, and that was the case when the social system in Germany was invented in the end of the 19th century, to see someone who is 70 happens only rarely, and to take care for one's parents is something that, sad as it may be, normally has a natural end quite early. Today, however, as in Germany, there are many Chinese who are over 70, and the percentage is rising, as we have just seen. The one-child policy that has helped to raise the per capita GDP in China is not helpful with regard to the problem of the aging population. That too we have seen. In the near future, fewer children will have to nourish an ever-increasing number of elderly people. We know this situation from our German experience very well. Yet here we still profit from social reforms that were introduced at the end of the 19th century. In China, a system of social security that reaches all persons concerned has yet to be invented. Thus, there's enough reason for conflict between the old and the young in China. The problem is rendered even more severe by the fact that the age of retirement in China is very low. For men, it is 60, and for women, normally 55. These people are considered old just because they have to give way to the great number of young people looking for a job. There's thus a double problem. The young need the jobs of the old, and the older they need the younger to feed them. One does see many people above age 60 or 65 in China who actually go to work, or who, especially in the non-state sector, start a second career after retirement. But this is not sufficient to fix the situation. For young people in China, the duty to respect their parents and grandparents has always been a heavy burden, remarked the Austrian scholar-diplomat Arthur von Rosthorn already at the beginning of the 20th century. Yet, despite all the iconoclastic attacks of the 20th century against the old system, one has the impression that this burden is still there. Young Chinese students who come to the West know about the expectations of their parents and relatives. Often the family has done everything in order to make the stay in Europe or the US possible. A bad grade is seen as a punishment, and not to come back home with a degree would be a disgrace that is almost unbearable. So young people do feel the burden in China, there is no question about this. On the other hand, within China itself, one recognizes contradictory signals now. A famous and in China widely read author and Chan monk, Nan Huaijin, who died at the age of 95 last September and who has lived in Taiwan since 1949 but then returned to mainland China in 2004 at the age of almost 90, where he then established an educational center, describes the difference between family values as the greatest difference between China and the West. According to him, to live in a Western, meaning American family, is like hell for the parents, while Chinese do cherish their parents. This is a self-image that many Chinese have of themselves. I often heard that, and of the world. But it is uninformed about the situation in the West, I think. We feel much more for our parents than some Chinese may think. And it also misrepresents what statistics now say about China. The one-child policy has produced a phenomenon that is widely known as the small emperors, Xiao Huangdi, children who have been brought up with too much care by their parents and who have absolutely no sense for others. It is this group of people that is targeted when Chinese politicians and intellectuals are talking about Xiao, in my opinion. Thus, whether filial piety is going to change the situation of elderly people is very questionable. The fast rise of the number of elderly speaks against this and lets the propagation of Xiao look like a desperate attempt at stopping a trend that does not have very much to do with a spiritual vacuum, but rather with hard social facts that need a political answer. Thank you.